Melancholia, therefore, borrows some of its features from mourning and others from the process of regression from narcissistic object choice to narcissism. It is, on the one hand, like mourning, a reaction to the real loss of a loved object, but over and above this, it is marked by a determinant which is absent in normal mourning, or which, if it is present, transforms the latter into pathological mourning. The loss of a love object is an excellent opportunity for the ambivalence in love relationships to make itself effective and come into the open. Where there is a disposition to obsessional neurosis, the conflict due to ambivalence gives a pathological cast to mourning and forces it to express itself in the form of self-reproaches to the effect that the mourner himself is to blame for the loss of the loved object, i.e., that he has willed it. These obsessional states of depression following upon the death of a loved person show us what the conflict due to ambivalence can achieve by itself when there is no regressive drawing in of libido as well. In Melancholia, the occasions which give rise to the illness extend for the most part beyond the clear case of a loss by death, and include all those situations of being slighted, neglected, or disappointed, which can import opposed feelings of love and hate into the relationship or reinforce an already existing ambivalence. This conflict due to ambivalence, which sometimes arises more from real experiences, sometimes more from constitutional factors, must not be overlooked among the preconditions of melancholia. If the love for the object, a love which cannot be given up, though the object itself is given up, takes refuge in narcissistic identification, then the hate comes into operation on this substitutive object, abusing it, debasing it, making it suffer, and deriving sadistic satisfaction from its suffering. The self-tormenting in melancholia, which is without doubt enjoyable, signifies, just like the corresponding phenomenon in obsessional neurosis, a satisfaction of trends of sadism and hate, which relate to an object and which have been turned round upon the subject's own self in the ways we have been discussing. In both disorders, the patients usually still succeed by the circuitous path of self-punishment in taking revenge on the original object and in tormenting their loved one through their illness, having resorted to it in order to avoid the need to express their hostility to him openly. After all, the person who has occasioned the patient's emotional disorder and on whom his illness is centered is usually to be found in his immediate environment. The melancholic's erotic cathexis in regard to his object has thus undergone a double vicissitude. Part of it has regressed to identification, but the other part, under the influence of the conflict due to ambivalence, has been carried back to the stage of sadism, which is nearer to that conflict. It is the sadism alone that solves the riddle of the tendency to suicide, which makes melancholia so interesting and so dangerous. So immense is the ego's self-love, which we have come to recognize as the primal state which instinctual life precedes. And so vast is the amount of narcissistic libido which we see liberated in the fear that emerges at a threat to life, that we cannot conceive how that ego can consent to its own destruction. We have long known it is true that no neurotic harbors thoughts of suicide which he has not turned back upon himself from murderous impulses against others. But we have never been able to explain what interplay of forces can carry such a purpose through to execution. The analysis of melancholia now shows that the ego can kill itself only if, owing to the return of the object cathexis, it can treat itself as an object. If it is able to direct against itself the hostility which relates to an object and represents the ego's original reaction to objects in the external world. Thus, in regression from narcissistic object choice, the object has, it is true, been got rid of, but it has nevertheless proved more powerful than the ego itself. In the two opposed situations of being most intensely in love and of suicide, the ego is overwhelmed by the object, though in totally different ways. As regards one particular striking feature of melancholia that we have mentioned on page 248, the prominence of the fear of becoming poor, it seems plausible to suppose that it is derived from an anal eroticism, which has been torn out of its context and altered in a regressive sense. Melancholia confronts us with yet other problems, the answer to which in part eludes us. The fact that it passes off after a certain time has elapsed without leaving traces of any gross changes is a feature it shares with mourning. We found by way of explanation, page 244-5, that in mourning time is needed for the command of reality testing to be carried out in detail, and that when this work has been accomplished, the ego will have succeeded in freeing its libido from the lost object. You may imagine that the ego is occupied with analogous work during the course of a melancholia. In neither case have we any insight into the economics of the course of events. The sleeplessness in melancholia testifies to the rigidity of the condition, the impossibility of effecting the general drawing in of cathexes necessary for sleep. The complex of melancholia behaves like an open wound, drawing to itself cathectic energies, which in the transference neuroses we have called anticathexes, from all directions and emptying the ego until it is totally impoverished. It can easily prove resistant to the ego's wish to sleep. What is probably a somatic factor and one which cannot be explained psychogenically makes itself visible in the regular amelioration in the condition that takes place towards evening. These considerations bring up the question whether a loss in the ego, irrespectively of the object, a purely narcissistic blow to the ego, may not suffice to produce the picture of melancholia, and whether an impoverishment of ego libido directly due to toxins may not be able to produce certain forms of the disease. The most remarkable characteristic of melancholia, and the one in most need of explanation, is its tendency to change round into mania, a state which is the opposite of it in its symptoms. As we know, this does not happen to every melancholia. Some cases run their course in periodic relapses, during the intervals between which signs of mania may be entirely absent or only very slight. Others show the regular alternation of melancholic and manic phases, which has led to the hypothesis of a circular insanity, it's bipolar disorder. One would be tempted to regard these cases as non-psychogenic if it were not for the fact that the psychoanalytic method has succeeded in arriving at a solution and effecting a therapeutic improvement in several cases precisely of this kind. It is not merely permissible, therefore, but incumbent upon us to extend an analytic explanation of melancholia to mania as well. I cannot promise that this attempt will prove entirely satisfactory. It hardly carries us much beyond the possibility of taking one's initial bearings. We have two things to go upon. The first is a psychoanalytic impression, and the second what we may perhaps call a matter of general economic experience. The impression which several psychoanalytic investigators have already put into words is that the content of mania is no different from that of melancholia, that both disorders are wrestling with the same complex, but that probably in melancholia the ego has succumbed to the complex, whereas in mania it has mastered it or pushed it aside. Our second pointer is afforded by the observation that all states such as joy, exaltation, or triumph, which give us the normal model for mania, depend on the same economic conditions. What has happened here is that, as a result of some influence, a large expenditure of psychical energy, long maintained or habitually occurring, has at last become unnecessary, so that it is available for numerous applications and possibilities of discharge. When, for an instance, some poor wretch, by winning a large sum of money, is suddenly relieved from chronic worry about his daily bread, or when a long and arduous struggle is finally crowned with success, or when a man finds himself in a position to throw off at a single blow some oppressive compulsion, some false position which he has long had to keep up, and so on. All such situations are characterized by high spirits, by the signs of discharge of joyful emotion, and by increased readiness for all kinds of action. In just the same way as in mania, and in complete contrast to the depression and inhibition of melancholia, we may venture to assert that mania is nothing other than a triumph of this sort. Only that here again, when what the ego has surmounted and what it is triumphing over remain hidden from it. Alcoholic intoxication, which belongs to the same class of states, may, insofar as it is an elated one, be explained in the same way. Here there is probably a suspension produced by toxins of expenditures of energy and repression. The popular view likes to assume that a person in a manic state of this kind finds such delight in movement and action because he is so cheerful. This false connection must, of course, be put right. The fact is that the economic condition in the subject's mind referred to above has been fulfilled, and this is the reason why he is in such high spirits on the one hand and so uninhibited in action on the other. If we put these two indications together, the psychoanalytic impression and the general economic experience, what we find is this. In mania, the ego must have got over the loss of the object, or its mourning over the loss, or perhaps the object itself, and thereupon the whole quota of anticathexis which the painful suffering of melancholia had drawn to itself from the ego and bound will have become available, page 253. Moreover, the manic subject plainly demonstrates his liberation from the object which was the cause of his suffering by seeking like a ravenously hungry man for new object cathexes. This explanation certainly sounds plausible, but in the first place it is too indefinite, and secondly, it gives rise to more new problems and doubts than we can answer. We will not evade a discussion of them, even though we cannot expect it to lead us to a clear understanding. In the first place, normal mourning too overcomes the loss of the object, and it too, while it lasts, absorbs all the energies of the ego. Why then, after it has run its course, is there no hint in its case of the economic condition for a phase of triumph? I find it impossible to answer this objection straight away. It also draws our attention to the fact that we do not even know the economic means by which mourning carries out its task, page 245. Possibly, however, a conjecture will help us here. Each single one of the memories and situations of expectancy which demonstrate the libido's attachment to the lost object is met by the verdict of reality that the object no longer exists. And the ego, confronted as it were with the question whether it shall share this fate, is persuaded by the sum of the narcissistic satisfactions it derives from being alive to sever its attachment to the object that has been abolished. We may perhaps suppose that this work of severance is so slow and gradual that by the time it has been finished, the expenditure of energy necessary for it is also dissipated. The economic standpoint has hitherto received little attention in psychoanalytic writings. I would mention as an exception a paper by Victor Tosk, 1913, on motives for repression devalued by recompenses. It is tempting to go on from this conjecture about the work of mourning and try to give an account of the work of melancholia. Here we are met at the outset by an uncertainty. So far we have hardly considered melancholia from the topographical point of view, nor asked ourselves in and between what psychical systems the work of melancholia goes on. What part of the mental processes of the disease still takes place in connection with the unconscious object cathexes that have been given up, and what part in connection with their substitute by identification in the ego. The quick and easy answer is that the unconscious thing presentation of the object has been abandoned by the libido. In reality, however, this presentation is made up of innumerable single impressions or unconscious traces of them, and this withdrawal of libido is not a process that can be accomplished in a moment, but must certainly, as in mourning, be one in which progress is long drawn out and gradual. Whether it begins simultaneously at several points or follows some sort of fixed sequence is not easy to decide. In analyses, it often becomes evident that first one and then another memory is activated, and that the laments, which always sound the same and are wearisome in their monotony, nevertheless take their rise each time in some different unconscious source. If the object does not possess this great significance for the ego, a significance reinforced by 1,000 links, then, too, its loss will not be of a kind to cause either mourning or melancholia. This characteristic of detaching the libido bit by bit is therefore to be ascribed alike to mourning and to melancholia. It is probably supported by the same economic situation and serves the same purpose in both. As we have seen, however, page 250, melancholia contains something more than normal mourning. In melancholia, the relation to the object is no simple one. It is complicated by the conflict due to ambivalence. The ambivalence is either constitutional, i.e., is an element of every love relation formed by this particular ego, or else it proceeds precisely from those experiences that involved the threat of losing the object. For this reason, the exciting causes of melancholia have a much wider range than those of mourning, which is for the most part occasioned only by a real loss of the object by its death. In melancholia, accordingly, countless separate struggles are carried on over the object, in which hate and love contend with each other. The one seeks to detach the libido from the object, the other to maintain this position of the libido against the assault. The location of these separate struggles cannot be assigned to any system but the Ux, the region of the memory traces of things, as contrasted with word cathexes. In mourning, too, the efforts to detach the libido are made in this same system, but in it, nothing hinders these processes from proceeding along the normal path through the PCS to consciousness. This path is blocked for the work of melancholia, owing perhaps to a number of causes or a combination of them. Constitutional ambivalence belongs by its nature to the repressed. Traumatic experiences in connection with the object may have activated other repressed material. Thus, everything to do with these struggles due to ambivalence remains withdrawn from consciousness until the overcome characteristic of melancholia has set in. This, as we know, consists in the threatened libidinal cathexis, at length abandoning the object. Only, however, to draw back to the place in the ego from which it had proceeded. So by taking flight into the ego, love escapes extinction. After this regression of the libido, the process can become conscious, and it is represented to consciousness as a conflict between one part of the ego and the critical agency. What consciousness is aware of in the work of melancholia is thus not the essential part of it, nor is it even the part which we may credit with an influence in bringing the ailment to an end. We see that the ego debases itself and rages against itself, and we understand as little as the patient what this can lead to and how it can change. We can more readily attribute such a function to the unconscious part of the work, because it is not difficult to perceive an essential analogy between the work of melancholia and of mourning. Just as mourning impels the ego to give up the object by declaring the object to be dead and offering the ego the inducement of continuing to live, page 255, so does each single struggle of ambivalence loosen the fixation of the libido to the object by disparaging it, denigrating it, and even, as it were, killing it. It is possible for the process in the ux to come to an end, either after the fury has spent itself or after the object has been abandoned as valueless. We cannot tell which of these two possibilities is the regular or more usual one in bringing melancholia to an end, nor what influence this termination has on the future course of the case. The ego may enjoy in this the satisfaction of knowing itself as the better of the two, as superior to the object. Even if we accept this view of the work of Melancholia, it still does not supply an explanation of the one point on which we were seeking light. It was our expectation that the economic condition for the emergence of mania after the Melancholia has run its course is to be found in the ambivalence which dominates the latter affection. And in this we found support from analogies in various other fields. But there is one fact before which that expectation must bow. Of the three preconditions of melancholia, loss of the object, ambivalence, and regression of libido into the ego, the first two are also found in the obsessional self-reproaches arising after a death has occurred. In those cases, it is unquestionably the ambivalence which is the motive force of the conflict. And observation shows that after the conflict has come to an end, there is nothing left over in the nature of the triumph of a manic state of mind. We are thus led to the third factor as the only one responsible for the result. The accumulation of cathexis, which is at first bound, and then, after the work of melancholia is finished, becomes free and makes mania possible, must be linked with regression of the libido to narcissism. The conflict within the ego, which melancholia substitutes for the struggle over the object, must act like a painful wound which calls for an extraordinary high anticathexis. But here, once again, it will be well to call a halt and to postpone any further explanation of mania until we have gained some insight into the economic nature first of physical pain and then of the mental pain which is analogous to it. As we already know, the interdependence of the complicated problems of the mind forces us to break off every inquiry before it is completed, till the outcome of some other inquiry can come to its assistance.